gap at the high school level. And a lot of that, I mean, there's a lot of work in practice for people like physics teachers and AAPT, but in terms of formal research that really addressed directly high school education, it's a little more limited. So in any such process, we're bringing together a committee of people who have expertise, and they have diverse expertise, and they're supposed to build on the best basis of existing research knowledge, but at every point you have to extrapolate beyond it and make some guesses. And that's what this framework does. So what is a framework? It's also a new idea, right, as far as K-12 science goes. In the previous iteration of science standards, states may have done it differently in different states, but the national process that led to what were called the National Science Education Standards didn't have a framework. They went directly to standards. This time around, and this was actually partly from the idea of Carnegie Corporation, who funded it, they said, well, we need a lot of practitioner knowledge in the process of developing standards. But we need a lot of science expertise in saying, well, what is it really important to learn? And so trying to step the process in 2 steps, we put together a committee which would say, what is important to learn? And then, based on that document, standards are now being developed. Now, the What is Important to Learn committee was 50% disciplinary scientists, members of the academy, a couple of Nobel Prize winners, not that that really tells you that they know anything about education. However, they do know something about science, so asking them what is the most important thing in their discipline that they want students entering college with, that makes some sense. The other half of the committee were people engaged in science education in multiple different ways, but science education research, some people with experience, like former state science supervisor, or former kindergarten teacher, now a teacher of teachers. So people with a different set of perspectives. But it was only 18 people, so obviously a limited set of perspectives. I'll go through here. So, as I said, it was funded by Carnegie Corporation. The idea is that the framework can inform the standards. But of course, if you're talking about what goes on in the classroom, standards is really a whole small piece of the puzzle. Standards have influence on all the other pieces, but all the other pieces have to work coherently if you really want to move the system in some way. And the pieces that I spell out here, teacher professional development is certainly one of them. Teacher pre-service education is another. Instruction, what's going on in the classroom, is another. Curricula and curriculum materials is another. And assessments is another, because if there are external assessments coming in, that drives what goes on in the classroom too. So the framework is intended to promote a vision which over time, and over time is important here because if you try to make overnight change, it doesn't work. We're thinking of evolution rather than revolution. Over time, the framework will shift all these pieces in a coherent direction. That's the hope, that's the goal. Whether it happens or not remains to be seen, but things are moving in many of these areas, and we'll see how far we can get. So, the process of going to standards, I'm going to talk a little bit about standards because that's the work that's going on right now. The process of going to standards is led by an organization called Achieve Inc. I won't tell you much more about them because I believe Pat will. And they put out an RFP for states to join them in the process. So the states actually have to commit some resources to this, and we actually expected 5 or 6 states. We've got 26 states that have signed on to this. And I say we because this was a conversation we had before the process started. I am not part of Achieve, and I'm really not part of the standards development process except from a distance looking in, because at some point in the end, the National Academy Committee that developed the framework is supposed to say, well, are the standards aligned to whatever the framework set. And so Achieve is working very hard to make sure that our answer to that is yes, by trying very hard to follow the standards. But this is just to say, this next generation science standards is the idea that if you have a common standards in math and in language arts, why not common standards in science too? And there are political reasons why some states might choose not to sign on to common standards in science, even if they've signed on to common standards in math and language arts. But the movement is rolling, and the fact that 26 states, after the framework came out, so they could see it contained evolution and it contained climate change, they did not back up. They signed up. And some of them are states you might not have expected, like Kansas and
Kansas.
You could go look around, but it's a pretty broad map, and there's actually, this is a little out of date, there's now some more states in the South too. So it's a network of states who are engaged in the process of reviewing the work that Achieve is doing, looking at it from the perspective of can we make it work in classrooms in our state. And so that process is underway as we speak. If you're not on the state team for reviewing, the first public draft, I believe, will be announced at the end of March, probably in an STA, but I'm not sure exactly. Somewhere around the end of March, there'll be a public draft, and every one of you should be looking at it and making comments on it and helping the process refine. Because I know from the process we did in the framework, putting out a public draft and getting comments from lots of directions is the only way you're going to get this work anywhere near right. Because the small group of people who are doing it get so engaged in the work, their heads are down, and they don't even see the flaws in what they're doing because they're working so hard to get to where they are that looking at it from outside really helps a lot to move it along and inform it from a much broader perspective. So let me now turn specifically to what's in the framework. How many people have looked at it? So you all should have known that Vote on Science Education did it, at least. There's more hands this time than the time before, but not all hands. So I will spend some time talking about it. It tries to define science education, and its goal is that science education should engage students in a coherent building of knowledge over the years, rather than, as it all too often is, a set of disconnected lessons which the students have to connect themselves. Secondly, it should engage students in the practice of science. Well, we call it the practices of science because we spell it out as a set of practices, as well as engage them in learning what scientists have learned through those practices. Because you don't understand what science is if you just learn the outcomes of it. You can only learn what science is by doing science and engaging yourself in the practice of conceptual development and modeling and thinking for yourself how to understand something. So learning to recite the periodic table doesn't help. Although I heard Linus Pauling do it. It's an interesting game. It impressed the kids in the 8th grade classroom when he did it. It doesn't really tell them very much. But learning to understand why the periodic table was an important development in the history of our understanding of the atomic theory of matter, that's another story altogether. So this is the names. I've told you what the Constitution is, but this is explicitly who they were. Not so important, except that they were all very much engaged in the work, and that was very, very helpful. We also, because a committee of volunteers doesn't get a lot of writing work done fast, and we were supposed to jumpstart this process, we hired some consultant teams. We divided them into 4 areas to give us sort of very first draft jumpstart ideas about where we were going and what we should do. So the design teams did the first step. The committee iterated that We put it out as a public draft, we iterated it again, and then we went through the usual academy review process, which is very stringent. Our 18 committee members, we had 21 reviewers. And we had something like 90 pages of comments that we had to respond to in response to review. So the process works quite well in getting the views of lots of people into a process to come up with a consensus document.